Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming back promptly from the break. For those that weren't at the last session, Nigel Ferry is my name. I am the chair of the Australasia Council of CREST. We've got a session this morning on securing the global supply chain for C&I. So we've got three great speakers. We've got, speaking of people running chapters, we've got Tom Brennan, who looks after the Americas chapter. We've got John, as you all heard, the great keynote this morning, and Chathura, who's also on the Australasian Council and on the, which focus group, TI?
Intel-led.
Intel-led.
And incident response.
Awesome. So welcome to the session. I'm going to throw it to these guys with some opening remarks about what's going on when it comes to the whole world of supply chain protection and critical national infrastructure. Again, for those that heard the session before morning tea about the cybersecurity strategy of the US, that was touched on, obviously, with C&I protection. Australia's got a cybersecurity strategy coming out in the coming months. You can guarantee it'll have critical infrastructure protect. Well, hopefully, I think we can guarantee it'll have it all the way through it. So, Tom, you're sitting next to me. I'm going to throw to you in the first instance. When we look at what is supply chain, what are the first things that come into your mind with protecting a supply chain? Or more to the point, and John talked about, I thought what was really interesting, how minute a supply chain can be. It's two parts, but...
Sure, yeah. So again, Tom Brennan, I'm the chair for the Americas for CREST. Obviously, I'm from New York, New Jersey, but more importantly, I'm embedded very deeply in critical national infrastructure in the United States. After serving as both a penetration tester and an incident responder for many, many years, the activities I do now is very much tied to some of the law enforcement as well as some of the legal aspects. But critical national infrastructure in the U.S. is certainly taking a spotlight. It has been there, I think, for 7+ years, most recently with some activities that have come out with people that have collaborated on documents that were done at the last session and other standards. But topics that are near and dear to the American side right now are things like CMMC. The Defense Industrial Base is classified as 600,000 organizations. 90,000 of them are top tier. And those providers to Department of Defense attest that they do certain controls. So they say that the NIST 800-171 or the 853 is compliant for their business in regards to the contract. However, many of them lie. And at the end of the day, that could lead to what's called the Lincoln Law, which causes organizations to be held accountable, including jail time, as well as losing their contracts. So there's a big effort around making sure that there's some controls and traceability just for DoD. On the commercial side, this may sound a lot like CREST to you, where that we, as CREST, have organizations that have gone through strenuous reviews, accreditations, certifications, et cetera, and can be held accountable and traceable, especially working in critical national infrastructure. So in closing, in the United States, my focus is to help bring CREST into that realm, which I've done now for 3+ years. And there's some big announcements that are coming this week, and we'll allude to some of them today.
Cool, thank you. I think that issue of accountability is such a strong one. The biggest reason I think that I started to fight this battleground of the supply chain security is that we got pretty good for a while at looking after our own internet stuff, our own enterprise systems, our own equipment even. People make a thing, they test the thing, it hits the QC bar, off you go. The problems often emerge, especially in infrastructure, which is massive and split and necessarily legally owned by many, many different people, is that nobody really wants to take responsibility for the lines between the boxes, and that is exactly where the problems happen. Because with the best will in the world, if you're not working together under the same regime, with the same standards, with the same processes, the two bits never gel together properly. And so everything Roland's been saying about collaboration and working together and sharing more information, everything about making these attestations and holding people kind of responsible for stuff, that's really, really kind of powerful. So I think the place where we need to concentrate is on having those traceable, accountable things where not only do we sort of go from this voluntary mode of, okay, if I've got something with strong provenance or with a letter of attestation, whatever it is, I'm good. we want to move right the other end of the table to say, if I receive something, whether it's a design document for CMC, as designed, or whether it's a sign-off or as built, or if you're doing all your operations, if I get anything and it doesn't have a strong attestation of quality and taking responsibility for it, I should not touch it. We want to move away from this idea of happy-go-lucky, computers are hard, if they break, whatever, to actually we've taken this seriously, we know what it does, we know what it's for, we have attested it, and we are going to fix it if it goes wrong.
Yeah, I think, based on what I'm hearing is lack of visibility is like a key thing, right? From an organization point of view, do you know your vendors throughout the supply chain, right? Yeah. And then, do you know your, not necessarily the perimeter. Perimeter is a, legacy concept now, right? So in your supply chain, who are the security providers, who are the software providers, who are the hardware providers, and then you might have maybe even cleaning providers to the organization, right? So we talk about attestation and accreditation from like a hardware black box point of view. What about the software used in there, right? So how do you trace that bill of material, as you mentioned in the morning, right? So I think the key problem there is you make the whole process complex. So therefore, that complexity is killing you, and then it's ruining your visibility, right? Have a proper visibility, then we can talk, right? I think that's one of the key aspect of battling supply chain issues.
Cool, thanks. So just on that visibility, I'll get back to you, Tom. It's a theme going on here, by the way. You mentioned some NIST stuff. Governance. I think, to me, all roads start with governance. Maybe that's because I'm a non-technical person, so that's all I can think of. But with that respect, where do you see, obviously you're going to say governance is super important, but to drill down to a few other levels with things like NIST standards, and I don't know where they're heading to next with supply chain, but where do you see, if as an organisation or a group of organisations are approaching securing a supply chain, what advice would you give to them from a governance perspective?
So I think commonly people pick a framework, and traditionally U.S.-based, a lot of folks have picked the NIST cybersecurity framework. If you're government sector, fine, good standard to go with. It's pretty acceptable and it translates very well. If you're commercial sector, it does not. And what the translation would be the Center for Internet Security version 8 controls. Those controls will identify things back to the cleaning crew, as well as physical and technology controls, assessments, etc. need to be in place. So again, if you're looking at a control-based review as to what you measure to, again, I think the CIS controls is a great place to start, because it also encompasses all the components of CREST with pen testing, threat intelligence, incident response, etc., as well as much, much more.
But sticking with CIS or NIST, and obviously NIST is huge in the US, not so huge. Oh, I don't know if it's so huge elsewhere. Semi-huge in Australia.
It's a good reference.
It's a good reference. Australian companies also like ISO stuff.
Yeah.
Which is similar.
I think a lot of people that were allergic that it comes out of the US sometimes, that NIST has that stamp. So therefore, organizations that have other frameworks, we all know about PCI, we all know about other components. Yep. Sometimes you manage to the framework that's most useful to your industry. And at this point, I believe CIS would be the most appropriate one.
So sticking to the governance theme, so they've got controls, obviously. Mm-hmm. Do they have regimes where people that are on the coalface, people sitting here probably and watching this, doing reporting to management and to the board and those sorts of things? Does it allow
absolutely
for that additional layers?
Yeah, I mean, for again, the CIS controls does. There's components about tied to risk registrars and reporting and formats. There's tools, there's standards, there's hardening components. There's an assortment of things that CIS puts out, but it's there for the community as well as for organizations that want to participate as a service provider or want to participate with it in a deeper way. Absolutely.
All right. I'm going to stick with that theme for now, John, for you to have your thoughts on it, and that is reporting to management, the board. It's been my belief that a lot of company directors don't know what to ask, so therefore they don't know what answers to receive. So if they're in charge of the cleaning company, we'll stick with that, or all the way to a multinational. What advice do you give people to advise, senior management and the board about, we need resourcing, we need to implement these controls, we need to report on these controls, dashboards, all those trendy sorts of things?
Yeah, it's a really tough question because actually often what they want is an easy answer and there isn't one.
They want to buy cyber, don't they?
Yeah, they want to buy, yeah, I would like one security, please.
Yeah, that's right.
Walk off. So let's skip that because that just doesn't make any sense. But assuming they are actually receptive, there are a handful of things. And I think firstly, demystifying cyber is just super important. My very strong belief on all of these things is that security, nobody needs security. By default, people need warmth, shelter, food, and friends, right? That's what you actually need, and anything else is derived. So if you take that through to, well, we work to make money, to go out with our friends. Security is like 3 or 4 steps back, and what you're really looking to say is we're running a business, our business has operational objectives, and we want to make sure that those operational objectives keep running under an increasingly broad and deep set of adverse conditions. So really all security is making your business resilient to whatever's going to happen to you. So the best thing that you can do is to start from that, and it frustrates the hell out of deep techie security people because they want to say the words and they want to be really clever and they want to show you the pen test, but actually at the business level, the only thing you can do is say, these are our objectives, these are our outcomes, this is the environment we're working in, and we would like to see how we're doing in that context. Particularly given the CNI state here. The worst thing you can do is go through a technical checklist of saying, have you updated your antivirus and have you patched the firewalls? Because you will miss something and it will get out of date and nobody will pay any attention and it won't work. So instead, go through, say, what are my business objectives? How are we doing with that? And that allows you to evolve, it allows you to keep up with current techniques, and it actually gives the executives what they want so they can see the value of the team rather than it just being a kind of boring and slightly unintelligible report every quarter.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because some board members want to pretend to be techie. So they want to see, the patching regime or the,
Right.
When was the last time an antivirus signature was updated or something like that? But no, I think it's a really good point. Chat, I'll sort of change the flavour a little bit, but keeping the flowing going, particularly with an incident response thing, which is your bag, and you talk to lots of big organisations. How do you see them approaching that governance layer when there has been an incident around protecting CNI?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting point, right? So many of these breaches even could happen from a third-party, fourth-party breach point of view as well, right? So they may not necessarily falling into your direct supply chain, but then, for example, in the FSI sector, you might working with a broker, and then that broker using another agency to sort customer data, and they got ransomware. So that's like a fourth party. So you have a third party, like a broker, and then you have a fourth party. So how do you have that visibility? How do you even know they're your fourth party, right? So having that contractual visibility, again, that's come down to that lack of visibility, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where I think, not necessarily the incident response point of view, but as you said, threat intel, right? So you contextualize threat intel into the organization, try to address that visibility problem. Who are your partners? Who are your entities you're working with, right? And then pump that threat intel back to the organization, then you understand and fill the gap within the supply chain, right? So if that fourth party is breach, what I'm gonna do from that point of view, right? So what's the stakeholders or the board view on how do we tackle that scenario? Could I say, as a large financial institution, now I'm gonna take over your incident response, right? So would you want to have a risk of turning the systems off or corrupting something, right? So genuinely you're trying to help, but then, would it backfire, right? As you said in the morning, I spent 2 days to figure out to give a politically correct statement rather than, helping the community, right? So I think that's a really interesting point. So again, you mentioned testing, right? So how do you contextualize testing and then feed that intelligence back to the testing, right? Is it a point in time pen test you do across the board, right? Or you're going to do a continuous sort of a, testing embed in your pipelines, right? So, and where to start, how to start, and where the gaps are, right? So that's actually the challenge.
So does that mean you're suggesting threat intel, I'll stick with what you're talking about, should obviously be used in your last example tactically, but then how do you use it strategically to inform senior management and the board?
Well,
Is it through the risk register? Is it through presentations? Is it
Through storytelling.
And I was going to say, it's open to, this is a question open to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's going to be storytelling in most cases, especially when it comes down to mapping examples to the 5 whys. The idea of saying, okay, so there was a peer in the news that had a problem. Well, why they have a problem? Because of technology. Okay, great. What part of technology failed? Why? Comes down to training, people, process, technology, right? Always the same thing. But I think if we're educating the board in your example the right way and getting them engaged in a way, it's very helpful. And as you may or may not be aware, particularly in the States now, we have director and operator insurance or DNO insurance. And if you're now holding a CIO title or a CISO even, you can be written into the DNO policy and you become actually part of the organization opposed to being an ancillary. So it becomes also a conversation, whether it be defense industrial based type organization or even just corporate America, about where does security play a role in the company.
There was actually an article, and I can't remember where it was, in the mainstream media, the tech mainstream media, about whether DNO Insurance policy would cover who was the Uber CISO that got...
Yeah.
Yeah, whether it would extend to what he did. And we're not here to cast aspersions on the outcome of the court matters, but it was an interesting article about the value of DNO Insurance, because DNO Insurance is, for those that don't operate in that space, is a really interesting thing. It's actually not there to pay out. It's not like ransomware insurance where something happens and they'll pay the ransom, for example. It's to pay the legal fees of directors and officers to...
Yeah. Well, it's chief scapegoat officer, CSO, is why that's...
You work for a law firm. You should know all about that sort of stuff.
And from an incident response point of view, right? So I think it's important to have defined playbooks, right, around dealing with such scenarios, right? So when you're in crisis, people panic. You might have a playbook, but still panic, but you panic less, right? So I think, you have that contextual define, okay, so you do ABC things, you always come up with scenarios which is not covered in the playbook, obviously, right? But then you have something to build upon and then you continuously building it, right? So it's just like continuous testing, you redefine your playbooks and keep building it, right? So I think that's not necessarily the way, but then another way to tackle it, right? So this is a $1 billion problem.
Something from the U.S.-centric approach, right? There is now a model that's being pushed in the United States tied to states, because in the United States, obviously, we have the federal government, but of course we have state government, which is more powerful, believe it or not. And states hold the laws that are tied to the businesses that operate in those states. They're now beginning to push out agendas and directives that organizations within those states will have to be registered, right? Just like a hairdresser that has to be registered, or another professional, IT or service providers will have to be registered. And then it has to be annual reviews with incident response and reporting. You heard about the words of DPO, data privacy officers, et cetera. So as the states become more focused on traceability and accountability, it changes the markets quite quickly. And as you start seeing different states across, at least in America's businesses that are operating there, will have to be licensed in different states as well.
I'm a bit, and that's useful, but I'm a bit concerned that those things, starting with 1386 and then Massachusetts privacy law and everything else that's sort of come in between, they're very consumer focused. They are private citizen and anti-advertising and Google is bad kind of things, which is great. But for the topic of this panel, if we're looking at critical infrastructure, the attacks are 180 degrees different. Apart from, you can trace stories of using some of these advertising or malware or personal targeting as a way in. Sure, you can. But in terms of holding companies to account and making them responsible for shipping dodgy software into a bridge, I'm not sure we are making great progress on that side of things, really.
Yeah, to your point, right? So shipping devices with dodgy software, right? So there may be not the intent to have dodgy software, unless it's coming from certain countries, right?
Yeah.
But how do you actually track that, right? So as a vendor, you might do a pen test again, a point in time, right? And then you have a seal saying, oh, yep, this is great. But we all know cybersecurity, and then we live and breathe in there. So today it might be secure. In Nigel's word, it might be resilient. But in another 1 hour's time, there could be a 0-day comes in again, log 5J come in, and then ruin everything, right? But then still that security certificate you embed on this device, it's valid now, right? So how do you actually invalidate it, right? How do you have a system to track a live sort of a certification?
Well, that's what certificate transparency and Geater for.
Correct,
That's
right?
That's exactly why we have them.
Yeah.
It's also what CREST OVS is all about.
Exactly, right? So that's the segue I want to bring in, and then probably Tom to share some insight around it. Because you've been a big advocate to OVS.
So show of hands, how many people here are familiar with OWASP, right? Anyone familiar with Top 10? All right, great. So we all are individuals associated with OWASP, right? Working on projects, things like that. But OWASP has no members, right? They have no organizations that attest that they're able to do the things that the products are about. And like you, I'm also involved in some of their projects. But if you're not familiar, the CREST announcement for OVS is to accredit service providers with deep understanding of software security. And this has been requested by not only governments, but regulators around the world, and that's kind of where it came from. The concept of being able to go out to market and find highly qualified organizations that not only do penetration testing, but also have deep experience in code review and other components within software, super, super important. So as if you're a buyer in the room and you're looking for qualified providers that do that, also scrutinize or look at your providers that they are OVS qualified. That would speak to the ASVS or the MASVS projects within OWASP tied to mobile security and tied to software standards. The OWASP Top 10, as an example, is a complete failure. It's Jeff Williams is a great friend, but he'll tell you himself it's a failure because the metrics will lie if you let them. What we need to do is focus on how to build software with controls that are defined within a control process, not looking at a bunch of bug reports and say, hey, look, we're at SQL injections is high up on the list again. Top 10, very bad way to run an IPsec program.
Any other comments on that?
A related comment, I suppose, just tying all these things together. That's great, by the way, and I think we should absolutely be doing. More professional standards are better. So the US-centric view, as far as I've seen recently, is spurred by a lot of activity coming out of the Executive Order 14028 on improving the nation's cybersecurity. That's where all the heat and light about S-bombs and things came out of, for example. Not that they were new then, but they just got a big advertising boost. Your comment about the Uber CISO, your questions about people being found out or having playbooks or being panicked or whatever, all of those actually, I think, come down to a fundamental mindset shift that we need to make if we're going to really make progress, which is that admitting mistakes is okay. It's a really nice, because panicking on a playbook, seeing an unfamiliar thing, how do I invalidate a certificate? Well, the best thing to do if you find out your stuff is vulnerable is to tell people as quickly as possible so that they can take their own steps to protect themselves. And if those steps mean that they switch off a machine or they station a human being next to it for a couple of days, that's still better than leaving them unknowingly vulnerable. But at the moment, people are really super scared to do that because they end up in the news, and especially on a big thing, something like Log4j or Kaseya or SolarWinds. All of those is just basically a game of chicken because everybody knows everybody's hit. And so you just have to wait to not be the first big logo in the news and you're okay. I get regular emails from SolarWinds marketing department because every time we publish an article and it makes reference to SolarWinds, they really want us to say sunburst attack. That was the official label, the actual name of it. Because SolarWinds actually hit VMware and Microsoft just as hard. But SolarWinds was the first logo in the news, and now everybody thinks it was their fault, and everybody thinks ill of them, and they've got a whole marketing machine that has to go through that messaging all the time. So, one of the things I really like about Executive Order 14028, and what would have possibly saved the Uber CISO in different circumstances, is that the fourth bullet after threat intelligence sharing and S-bombs and whatever the third one is, I forget, fourth bullet is we have to create a regulatory environment which is permissive and encouraging of mistakes, sharing of problems, updating things, and actually take a sensible approach that security is not black and white, and people are not good or bad, and it's not like an all or nothing disaster. We know it's going to evolve. We know we have to patch it. So let's just be open about it and congratulate people for being open about it and honest and fixing the problem quickly rather than pasting them through the news.
But I think you have a challenge in that discussion around liability, class action suits, fines,
Absolutely.
things that are associated with the way that the countries or way that organizations operate. So being transparent and being black and white, I think, is wonderful in our approach to at most anything. But most corporations are going to say, wait, not unless it's under attorney-client privilege, because I'm not going to have that conversation in a public forum without protected communication. I'm not going to be held liable to something that's said on the record. We could quickly spiral out of control when an organization has a problem, admits to it, and tries to be transparent about it, and they get hit with a class action suit by some lawyer that's chasing an ambulance.
Okay. This conversation reminds me of a comment one of my good friends, Jason Morrell, chair for Cyber, actually said once, right? So in Australia, bushfire is a thing, right? So whenever there's a bushfire happen, like one fire department or one entity, not isolating that part and say, oh, there's a fire, to go there, right? So go, rush in and help them, right? But similarly, when there's an incident or when some entity is going through a breach, everyone is isolated from it and like, they got hacked, not us, right? Why that? Everyone running away from it, right? Why not collectively you help, right? So there are some industries, especially comes around critical infrastructure, there are intelligence sharing platforms and then knowledge sharing platforms, they help, but from a wider community, why we actually shy away from this? Is this because of the legal repercussions, or is it because, as you mentioned, my profits or, politically correct statements, right? I think, we need to deviate from that view and see how you collectively make the industry better. And, collaboration is the key to that.
I think you see that it actually happens with or without it being formal. The ISACs are very important in pulling people together.
Absolutely.
And collaborating and sharing information. But yeah, there's obviously rules of the road, right? Who's responsible for what? Who's going to be my breach coach? Who's going to take the lead? Who's my incident commander, right? All of those components fall into a successful recovery to make sure it's under control.
Yep.
But just on that, Tom, we've had some big breaches, 3 big ones in Australia in the last 6 or so months, and you've got the media that's hungry for statistics. It's like, how many people got done over? What were the credentials? Blah, 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 blah. And of course, you feel sorry for the security teams because they just can't go like that and say, oh yeah, this is the dump that's on the dark web. It's not that simple, but the media don't care because they take the least common denominator, and the politicians unfortunately don't care. So you got any pearls of wisdom for going back to the playbook of the chat was talking about, of how you address that, because you need messaging out to the market, to the if you're a listed company, it's even more important. Stakeholders, customers, staff, all that sort of stuff, and you just don't know. You're not going to know once you've been popped.
Well, again, back to critical national infrastructure, right? We have reporting requirements within a certain amount of time to report information, unless it's under attorney-client privilege, by the way. So there's different components of how that actually gets exposed. But I think that, the whole media side, we've all seen the fake news things get spun up as well. So I think many technologists are, we're about the data, we're about the facts, we're about what the data shows us. We won't make a recommendation. We'll say, here's what we found, here's the data, and then it's up to somebody else to interpret it. And usually that person's a lawyer, unfortunately, and he's going to spin it the way he wants. But it is what it is. But I think, again, collectively working together, ISACs that communicate, groups that want to participate, drills are very important, of course. And then lastly, the reporting requirements. I mean, there's organizations now in the states that different states have different reporting schedules. It makes it kind of crazy when you're a business operating, let's say, in New Jersey, and I got people in California, Ohio, Florida, and I have a problem. I have different requirements to report based on the states that these people are all residing in. So it makes it very challenging for us in the states.
I think to your question around like a playbooks, it's important to define those communication playbooks as well, right? So there's no point of just having the playbook. You need to drill it, right? So you tabletop tabletop, right? So that's where you improve, and then you identify gaps. You don't necessarily need to have a real incident to identify gaps, right? So once you tabletop it, just making it more resilient to this kind of imminent threats.
Yep. No.
Something that makes that, you asked about the reporting and things, NIS, it's enforced all around Europe, although weirdly, so the reporting window is 72 hours, doesn't matter where you are, so we've got commonality there. The difference is what the impact is, because in the UK you can be fined up to £20 million for a breach. That probably is enough to convince people. In Poland, it's about £500,000. Nobody's going to care about £500,000. They're just not going to do it, right? So we've got different problems there. But one of the bigger problems you have with answering those questions quickly, like you say, is if you have a sort of standard breach and you're just swept up in the latest NotPetya or whatever, I would argue it's probably reasonably easy to find out. You just assume your entire customer database is affected and you print that number. The problem with critical infrastructure is that it's much more pernicious than that, typically.
Human life.
Things like, well, there's human life, which even makes people even more wary of admitting things too early. But the technology itself is different and the attacks are different. So things like Mirai, for example, not to redo Stuxnet because it's been done twice today already, but Mirai had special code in it that characterized and understood certain aspects of GCHQ and NCSC computers. And it knew when it was in a system that was owned by our security services. And you might imagine that when they very first found this out, you might imagine that was because it was targeting the security services. It wasn't. It was exactly the opposite. It was programmed to detect when it was on an expert's computer and delete itself immediately because it wanted to stay hidden and was building up this massive, many tens of thousands of devices, mostly in Turkey, building this massive botnet that eventually went whack all at once. And it was deliberately hiding. And so doing that investigation and finding out what the fallout is and how long it's been there is a different problem for critical infrastructure, I think. So,
but it goes back to tabletop too, right? Because the only difference between the people in this room and the bad guys is ethics. Right? So if we tabletop those mass scenario problems within our own business and look at how would we really cause mass destruction and death in some cases, that's what you're defending against. You're defending against yourself because having a notion that I might have an investigation on a machine that would be concerning to me, it's a smart tactical approach as a bad guy, right? Okay, kudos. Hey, that's a pretty good idea. So I got to think about that in my threat model as well when I'm decompiling something or figuring out how to explode it in Cuckoo and figure out where it goes, how it works.
No. All right, we've got time for questions. We've got one at the back already.
Taking you back to kind of like framework standards, obviously they lag behind a bit. Do you think that standards such as ISO, NIST and things like that are potentially doing enough with supply chain attacks and protecting against that? I know that ISO specifically is updated recently to include threat intelligence and things like that. However, are they doing enough around supply chain, third-party assurance, that type of thing? And what would you advise them to NIST? If you could advise ISO or NIST, what would you do?
So never be too specific is obviously the way of avoiding lag. Are they doing enough? I think they're trying. But again, I always like to cast back to NIS because it is technically enforced, but I don't see a lot of it actually happening. But that absolutely has a ton of sort of supply chain vectors in it and things you should check, and takes, I think, a reasonable-ish view that maybe it's backwards, maybe it's not, but it's just true. The person doing the operation is the person responsible, a company responsible for making sure the thing works. So if you're a water company, you are responsible for making sure the water is not poisonous. If you're a electric company, you get the electric around and don't have random fires in the middle of the countryside. You were always responsible for that. And the fact that you now have computers alongside your vast, long, insulated, buried copper wires actually is of no consequence. They don't care. You're still responsible for these outcomes. And now here's some things to think about that now computers are in. So the responsibility sits with the person procuring. And I think where we've fallen down, though, slightly is that we haven't pushed enough to enable the visibility they need to make that smart decision. So I think the next place where it should go is that, yes, we've got the frameworks for the operators, I think actually are okay between NIS and NCSC. If you look at all the principles, NCSC published principles of cyber on various topics from time to time, which are informative rather than regulations, but they increasingly are also looking at third-party suppliers and supply chain risk and software and whatever. So on that side, I think they're doing great. On the side of enforcement that would actually push vendors and the service operators in the middle to actually make things better, I think that's a bit weak. That needs to be improved.
So I'll answer it a little bit differently, I think. I believe that the security is not compliance, right? So if we have compliance items and guidelines and checklists and things like that, super important. From a NIST perspective, I believe it's John Bayer who's responsible for most of the directive items that are under the NIST 800 series. And when new revs come out, they always go into RFC. At least for the Americas that I represent with the CREST organization, all my CREST member companies are invited heavily to participate and comment on RFCs to help shape some of that checklist or compliance stuff. But the point I want to make, though, is that I think that that's, as was said, is the basics. You're still responsible for running the water system. You're still responsible for that. That's core business. And then you got to go back to the tabletop piece and go, okay, well, what's my threat scenario here? Who's my actor? What am I worried about? So the most successful guidance I give to anyone these days, quite frankly, is pick a framework, own it, know it, manage to it, and then that way, whatever the organization's risk tolerance is, you can at least map to something that you didn't create, and you can kind of reference it. I think it's a really good place to start, regardless of which one you choose. I, again, happen to like Center for Internet Security version 8, but that's just me.
So yeah, I think you just touched on something.
Yeah, I also like CIS, just if people are looking for reading material, I think it's great.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think you've touched on probably the more systemic issue there. And there's a good abundance of frameworks guidance, but there's still a lack of commonality of what the supply chain actually is. And
Yeah.
I think that then leads into, organisations don't know what risks to consider. So it'd be interesting to see your views, probably Tom in the first instance and Nigel, of how should organisations then drive a commonality in terms of risk language, etc.
So it's an interesting one. Again, because the consumer stuff took the early headlines on this, and probably will always take the headlines because it's easy to tell a scare story to a person rather than a business. So, we have had this kind of supplier risk stuff for a very long time. And once GDPR came in, now I was working, where was I? I was at Thales at the time, I think, when it came into force. So we were supplying lots of things to federal people and banks and whatever places that take this seriously. And we started getting supplier questionnaires. And every single company had a very slightly different set of language that they used. And so every time we sold a thing, we had to fill in basically the same 20 questions and then a different 5 questions on the end. And it takes forever. And it changes all the time. And we weren't able to bank anything. And so a lot of the mindset, certainly that I've experienced in businesses where they spend time on this, has gone on there. And I can't see them having the brain state to come back. So there's a bit of a focus area problem there. But there is some good news. So there are companies around. There's a company called Risk Ledger. I don't really know them, but I think they do a reasonable job. Risk Ledger as one of several who will actually concentrate that supplier information. They say this is just untenable. We can't be dealing with a ton of bilateral contracts all the time. So we will assess their posture, we'll assess their security, we'll assess the details that you never want to specify, like how is your cloud data storage encrypted? Because you kind of want to know that, but you can't fix it in blood. They concentrate all of that, and then you go and say, okay, they're 90% good. I'm just going to ask them the short questions. So there are starting to be some things that help. I just worry that the focus isn't necessarily helping this topic yet. I think it's much more on the data protection side.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It's certainly a tax on the business, which has to provide people to do the work, and the questionnaire piece is always quite dramatic within the business because they have teams of people in some cases that have to deal with this, which is fine. But at the end of the day, building it to a standard, building something that's going to be there, and then each company has to make its own independent risk issue, right? If you're taking I don't know, if you're taking F500 into your business because you're in lithium battery storage and you have a supplier problem with F500 for encapsulation of lithium fires, well, that's now becomes a super important risk in the supply chain of that vendor. And oh yeah, that vendor has another ancillary problem, it's a third-party risk. Well, that's your only provider. So as they start to understand what business am I really in? Is email the most important thing, or is F500 the most important thing to put out a lithium fire? It just really depends on the organization. That's where I think we get into the technologists and the business guys working together and trying to have some of this stuff bleed over and actually be important.
I think the checklist is interesting. I was, not that long ago, working at a large Australian university, and we got a checklist because we were providing professional education to another very, very large organisation in Australia. The two things we sort of thought were interesting, one is we didn't know what good looked like when we were answering it. It was just like, answer this, you know. And then secondly, we were dealing with sales to salespeople transactions. Was there any discussion between those people and the technical people from their transactions to saying, well, if these people fail, are we going to stop them providing this training, for example? And it's, I don't know what the right answer is. We thought it was interesting.
Well, it's a score.
It is a score, yeah.
Am I willing to do business with this guy who's a C+? If so, maybe I can, or I have to compare vendors, or what's the risk?
Again, it's come down to your risk appetite, right? So whether, what's the quality of the supplier from the product and services, as well as the security of it, right? So it's
But if the organisation's trying to do risk transfer or risk acceptance or...
Usually transfer.
Yeah, usually.
But that might be reasonable. I mean, maybe I'm a dreamer because we gave almost opposite answers in some way to the first question, but that's only because, well, you described the world as it is and I described it the way I would like it to be. And it would be nice if we didn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good and say, well, you have to accurately fill in a perfect objective score for your security. At least I would like to see a move towards a place where people who are trying are considered more favourably than people who are not trying, and just finding the transparency, the openness, the willingness to respond to incidents outside of a sales process.
So that point I think is important from where I've sat as an expert witness in court. Having lawyers arbitrate over who's responsible for something, and one of those questions becomes, so, organization on the stand, what framework did you measure your cybersecurity to? NIST? What actions did you do during that review? Have you had any third parties involved? Have you had any third-party pen tests? You use accredited service providers. The idea of having that now go to litigation is really a thing, and that's really where the traceability comes in. And I think a lot of the legal aspects of this are helpful to our industry because we try to measure what good looks like, and we mostly zealots in the space about doing things the right way. Sometimes our peers, whether they be auditors or even lawyers, can be very helpful in helping set the standard because again you're trying to help a business not go to court, not litigate about a particular matter, but it does happen. And when you are called in as the expert to represent that business and you're defending somebody on stand, and I'm asking you the question through the attorney about, well, what training do you have? Or what accreditation do you hold? Or what is your experience in this particular thing that your organization fell victim to? Again, comes down to liability. And that's where people are a little bit resistant sometimes of being transparent because they don't want to be liable.
Yeah. I think the discussion, the insight I got that point is, this is not a technical problem we're trying to solve, right? So this is the business problem. Correct. So it's like all of business problem, right? So technical is just play one operational layer of it, right? So then you top it up throughout the hierarchy or the different frameworks within the organization.
Awesome point. Any other questions? We've got time for one more question. Up the back left, microphone, thank you.
Thanks very much for your panel discussion today, very informative. Just a quick one on the storytelling side of it and the kind of whole thing around mindsets and how is that kind of like changing and improving? Because I think in my journey I always find that not everyone's on the same page, and great, there's all these frameworks and we've got to kind of like adhere to them and work to the relevant areas of them and report against them. And as you say, Tom, you may get called up in court, all right, to kind of like support what's been done for a particular organisation. But is there more to do in that space? And also when reporting to the board and various other people within businesses, is there still a gap there of, you know, I know there's some good work that's been done, and it's all down to the people that are there explaining and storytelling and telling the narrative, right? But I just want to get your insights around that, where you see that, where that journey's gone, and are we in a good place, or is there still more to do in that space?
So from my opinion, I think there's a lot to do in that space. I think you hit it on the head, that it comes down to the people on the team. And that's where sometimes there's a separation between the technologists and the people that are working with the business on behalf of the organization, working as a team. Right? It's one thing to be the security guy who's responsible for the thing. It's something else to be responsible to communicate and help others understand. So to your point, I think that, again, picking a framework, managing to it the best you can, using it as an illustration of progress, being able to have a conversation and with the right team. If you feel that you're not getting that conversation at that company, then you're at the wrong company. Time to leave, just to let everybody know that. Our roles in information security are important. And if the businesses want to take your opinion and use it within their organization, fantastic. If they don't, again, you can educate them as to why you should be at the table to have a conversation, and if it's not the right fit, it's not the right fit. But to your point, I think a lot of this comes down to growing the trust within the business, and the business having to hire the right people to be part of that leadership team to help drive it forward.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling, it's not something that's special to us or new. I mean, Grimm's fairy tales and to some extent Hans Christian Andersen were designed to warn people about the many dangers and security steps they should take when wandering out into the woods and cavorting with strange people. We've always had that. We should always have that. I think there is this temptation to go too far into the weeds as security folks, because absolutely it's important. But no, you need to tell the Grimm fairy tale version, not the textbook science version.
Or at least keep it simple, right? The three little pigs. There's a little one that has no security. There's kind of security. Then there's the high security. Give them that example. Maybe they'll get it.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the questions. Thank you to the panel. Please join me in thanking the panel for their time. It was awesome. Well done, gents.